Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed for another GPU battle. Recently I checked out how the Radeon RX 580 and GeForce GTX 1060 compared in 27 games and found that overall performance was very similar. The RX 580 offered just 2.5% more performance overall. In the end, I acknowledged you really could go either way depending on preference. That said, I picked the RX 580 as I appreciated its slightly better performance in modern titles, its superior low-level API numbers, and the fact that FreeSync is a strong selling point for mid-range graphics cards. Also, the fact that the MSRP is around $20 US lower helped out, and it got the red team over the line for me. Well, the dust has settled on that one, and 1,400 comments later, the internet's a better place. So I guess it's time to stir up the hornet's nest and do it all over again. In an effort to do just that, I'll be taking the new Radeon RX 570 and putting it head-to-head against the GeForce GTX 1060 3GB. Now, in a perfect world where graphics card availability isn't an issue, the RX 570 should come in at about $170 US, making it a good bit cheaper than the $200 3GB GTX 1060. Right now though, more than a month since the RX 570 was released, cards are still selling for $200 US and availability is poor at best. Therefore right now it's actually easier and cheaper to pick up a 3GB GTX 1060, and there's a nice MSI model selling for $180 US for example. Anyway, in terms of pricing they are quite similar, and predictably availability will eventually improve for the RX 570. So I guess the next question is, which one should you buy? Well, to find out, we have 29 games on the menu, all of which have been tested at the 1080p and 1440p resolutions on our Intel Core i7-7700K test system, which has been clocked at 4.9 GHz. Please note my focus will almost be entirely on the 1080p resolution, as I feel this is primarily where gamers seeking this caliber of graphics card will be gaming. Representing the green team is MSI with their GTX 1060 Gaming X3G, and for the red team we have Gigabyte with their Aorus brand RX 570 4G. MSI has applied a 4% factory overclock to their card, while Gigabyte's gone with a slightly more mild 3% overclock. So much of a muchness then. Kickstarting things off, we have a bit of an oldie, though we did test with the updated HD client. Quite a few of you do seem to enjoy playing World of Tanks, so this is a game I've started including in a lot of my tests. The game does appear to prefer Nvidia hardware, as the 1060 was 8% faster. That said though, for those gaming at higher resolutions, the green team's advantage in this title will become more significant. Now we're going from blowing up tanks to jacking cars and throwing grenades at prostitutes if you're Brian from Tech City. The yes man's an oddball. Anyway, like World of Tanks, we find that Grand Theft Auto is another game that favours the green team, quite heavily I might add. The 1060 offered 22% more frames at 1080p, and in fact the minimum was greater than that of the RX 570's average. The Witcher 3 is the last pre-2016 title that I've tested, and it's another game that favours the GTX 1060 over the RX 570, this time by a 9% margin. That said though, I do test this game with Hairworks enabled, you know, because Nvidia bias and all that noise. Right, so next up we have Rise of the Tomb Raider. You guys ever tried swimming in this game? I recommend you check it out. Where was I? Yeah, the 1080p results for the RX 570. It's a fraction faster than the GTX 1060 when comparing the average frame rates, but a country mile ahead for the minimum. Whereas the GTX 1060 dropped down to 31 FPS, the Radeon bottomed out at just 41 FPS. Impressive stuff from the red team, given this is an Nvidia sponsored title. Ashes of the Benchmark has been included because, well, it's a 29 game benchmark video and I needed the numbers. At 1080p we see a 53 FPS average for both GPUs, though the 1060 did manage a slightly better minimum result. Moving to 1440p weighs heavily in the favour of the RX 570. Far Cry Primal generally goes the way of the green team, and we certainly see this when comparing the GTX 1060 and RX 570. I'm not going to say the margins were extreme, but the 1060 was faster at both resolutions and enjoyed a 9% advantage at 1080p. Tom Clancy's The Division was tested exclusively using DirectX 12, and you could argue that using DirectX 11 would afford the 1060 one or two more frames. I know Brian would. It's a fair point though, and it would see performance much the same between the two GPUs. Nevertheless, this is an apples to apples comparison, and the 570 was 3% faster. I doubt this will weigh much on the overall result. Next up we have Hitman. Yes, I've included Hitman, much to the delight of those Hulk-coloured fanboys. This title does deal Nvidia quite the blow, as the RX 570 was 18% faster, hitting an average of 80 FPS to the 1060 68 FPS. Whereas AMD fans get Hitman, Nvidia fans get Quantum Break. See how that works? Here the 1060 was 9% faster on average at 1080p, with a rather healthy 70 FPS, though the RX 570 did manage to keep the average above 60 FPS at all times, so overall gameplay was very smooth. Okay, time for Overwatch, or rather the Zarya benchmark, where I let 12 Zaryas set on easy mode loose to run around and pretty much just annoy each other. It's fair to say no Zaryas were harmed during this benchmark. Using the Epic Quality preset, both mid-range GPUs provided very respectable performance, and quite shockingly, the RX 570 just managed to edge ahead of the 1060 in this one. Doom provides little challenge for these GPUs at 1080p, and both averaged well over 100 FPS at all times in our test scene. The RX 570 was on average 12% faster than the GTX 1060, but again with both pushing over 120 FPS at 1080p and well over 60 FPS at 1440p, it's not really a significant win for the red team. Total War Warhammer throws up some interesting results. Here we see the RX 570 leading when it comes to the average frame rate, but falling quite far behind for the minimum result. Performance was still very smooth on the AMD card, but it kind of makes it difficult to call a winner here. The 1060 pulled back in the lead for Mirror's Edge Catalyst, beating the RX 570 by a convincing 12% margin at 1080p. That said though, both cards did push over 60 FPS at all times. The 1060 remained ahead for F1 2016, though with just 3 FPS in it for the average and 1 FPS when comparing the minimum frame rate at 1080p, it was a close battle indeed. Although Deus Ex Mankind Divided is an AMD-sponsored title and we tested using the DirectX 12 API, the GTX 1060 performs admirably at 1080p, matching the RX 570. The GTX 1060 was overwhelmed at 1440p, and I'd say this is a VRAM capacity issue. That said, with an average of just 34 FPS for the RX 570, it wasn't exactly smooth on either graphics card. Battlefield 1 provided a very even battle between these two budget heavyweights. Basically, we ended up with a dead heat at 1080p, while the RX 570 was able to edge ahead by a 5% margin at 1440p. As I mentioned earlier, I am mostly concerned with 1080p performance for this video, so it was great to see both GPUs maintaining well over 60 FPS at all times. Oh, Mafia 3, how is it that after 6 months since your release, it still takes a GTX 1080 to play at 1080p using the high quality settings? And it's not like the game's easy to tweak either, it only offers a low, medium or high preset, so we're not testing with some kind of extreme hyper type quality setting. Anyway, even at 1080p, both GPUs fail to get anywhere near 60 FPS, so the 1060's 13% victory here is a bit hollow. That said, downgrading to the medium quality preset will boost performance, and the 1060 should maintain its lead. Gears of War 4 is another Nvidia sponsored title, this time a DX12 title, so this helps the 1060 hang in there with the RX 570. Overall performance was much the same on both graphics cards at 1080p, though the RX 570 did pull ahead at 1440p. Titanfall 2 is an AMD special, though it has to be said I was expecting the RX 570 to be more than 5% faster than the GTX 1060 here. Still though, both did maintain over 60 FPS at all times when playing at the 1080p resolution. We see yet another close battle in Civilization 6. This time, the RX 570 was 6% faster at 1080p, though this did only account for a 4 FPS advantage. I should note that the minimum frame rate performance was much the same. In fact, the GTX 1060 was 1 FPS faster here. Like Titanfall 2, Call of Duty Infinite Warfare is another AMD special, and this time it really shows. The RX 570 enjoyed a massive 16% performance advantage over the GTX 1060 at 1080p, and here the 570's minimum frame rate was greater than the 1060's average, so a very strong win for AMD here indeed. Fresh off their biggest win, AMD now suffers through their greatest loss in another title released in November of 2016. Here we see when playing Dishonored 2 that the 1060 is 25% faster than the 570, and that's obviously a big deal. Whereas the 570 dips down to 40 FPS, the 1060 never dropped below 50 FPS. The GTX 1060 was again faster than the 570, this time when testing with Watch Dogs 2. Here it enjoyed a 10% performance advantage at 1080p when comparing the average frame rate. That said though, the 570 did do better when comparing the minimum frame rate, though it was just 2 FPS faster. Okay, what's going on here? Before you ask, no, I didn't accidentally test the 1060 at the 4K resolution. Using the very high quality preset, Resident Evil 7 is extremely demanding on VRAM. As a result, the 1060 3GB completely tanks. I had planned to see how far you had to relax the quality settings before the 3GB card comes to life, but sadly I ran out of time. I'm actually going to end up putting the final touches on this video just hours before I end up getting on a plane to head to Computex, so these results will have to do for now, though I do feel they're a little incomplete. Moving on, both GPUs did a great job with For Honor, averaging over 70 FPS with a minimum of 57 FPS. The GTX 1060 was a fraction faster overall, but as you can see, performance was very similar, even at 1440p. Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands plays into the favour of the GTX 1060. Here it was 11% faster than the RX 570 at 1080p. That said, at 1440p the 570 came back, as it often does, and matched the GTX 1060. The GTX 1060 manages to come away with the win in Mass Effect Andromeda, edging out the RX 570 by a 6% margin at 1080p. The 1600 also managed to maintain its lead at 1440p, though with both GPUs rendering less than 40 FPS on average, you will want to reduce the quality settings a bit more here. Next up we have Dawn of War 3, and this one went the way of the red team. Here the RX 570 was 8% faster than the GTX 1060, though both did perform very well at 1080p. Wrapping things up is Prey, and for the last game we have a rather well put together game with excellent optimization. This means even with the very high quality settings in play, both GPUs smash through the 60 FPS barrier at 1080p. The 1600 though did come out on top, delivering 11% more performance, and yes, we did test with the latest version of the game. In the words of Jeremy Clarkson, power! Yeah, time to look at the power consumption, and unfortunately in this case, more isn't better. Jeremy wouldn't understand. The RX 570 pushed total system consumption at almost 300 watts, which frankly is still very manageable, despite the fact that the same system with the 1060 consumed almost 20% less. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our journey to discover which brand offers the best mid-range budget contender. Is it AMD or is it Nvidia? Cue the swoosh effect. And as we find all too often, it's either, or is it both? Well, whatever the case, the RX 570 ended up delivering just a single extra frame on average at 1080p, and surprisingly just 2 extra frames at 1440p. That said, this graph does take into account those Resident Evil 7 results, which were massive outliers. Let me show you what I mean. If we include all the results, this is what the overall picture looks like. As you can see, it's pretty even across the board until you throw in that one game where the GTX 1060 3GB completely tanked. For now, this game is clearly an outlier, as we didn't see any other situations where the RX 570 provided playable performance, while the GTX 1060 3GB failed. I'm keen to see just how much you have to downgrade the quality settings before the 1060 recovers in that title, but like I said, it'll have to wait till I get back from Computex. For now, if we remove the outlier, the RX 570 actually ends up being 2% slower overall, but to be fair, the results are still very even. The RX 570 was faster in 13 games and slower in 14, while they tied in a single title. So as we often find, there's really no clear winner here. It simply boils down to what games you play when deciding which GPU is best for you. They both have their strengths and weaknesses. The 1060 3GB's greatest weakness is of course the limited memory buffer, but to be fair, at 1080p, this is rarely an issue. The 3GB model was released almost a year ago now, and back then we heard how it was dead on arrival, even for those gaming at 1080p. Well, with the exception of one game, we have 28 other examples that show the 3GB 1060 providing very playable performance at 1080p. And no, there wasn't any stuttering or micro stuttering or anything like that. I've checked all the frame time data, the 3GB card performs very well. I just haven't shown the 0.1% and 1% lows for the GPU testing because most prefer the minimum and average. These might be something I'll change in the future. I am doing it for CPU testing, but now for GPU testing, the minimum seems to show exactly what the 1% does for almost every test. Anyway, if you bought a 3GB model last year, you're probably wondering what all the fuss is about. The advantage of the 1060 is considerably better power consumption, more overclocking headroom, and cooler operating temperatures. The advantage of the RX 570 is of course the slightly larger VRAM buffer, which did seem to help it stay out of trouble as we saw strong performance across the board. And finally, the availability of an impressive range of FreeSync monitors is also a big bonus. So, which one would I go with? Next question, please. Really, it comes down to which one's the cheapest and the games that you intend on playing. I do feel like the RX 570 is probably the safest bet, but I also really like the lower power consumption of the GTX 1060 3GB, which generally allows board partners to put on cooler sound, well, create cooler graphics cards that are quieter. That's what I'm trying to say. Cooler and quiet. Cool and quiet. I think that was a thing once. It's also a better pairing for budget builds, in my opinion, that use lesser quality power supplies. Really though, basing your decision on which one I would pick might not be the best choice on this one, and not just because I really don't know which one I would pick of the two. Comes down to a few things. For example, if you have a FreeSync monitor, or you plan on getting one in the near future, then I'd say the RX 570 becomes the obvious choice. That said though, if you already have a monitor that doesn't support an adaptive V-Sync technology, and you have no plans to upgrade your monitor in the near future, and you play games that tend to favour the green team, then the GTX 1060 might be the smarter choice. In the end, I've given you a heap of information and data in the hope that you can now make an informed buying decision. And I'm going to leave it at that for this one. I really need to go pack my bags and head to the airport. I'm super excited about the Computex trip this year, and the fact that MSI has sponsored the channel is a seriously big deal. If you love what we do at Harbour Unboxed and you really want to support the channel, then please be sure to check out all our Computex coverage over the next week. That'll really help us out. After that though, when I get back from Computex, I will be jumping right back into the benchmarking. I'm your host Steve. See you again soon, guys.